The transatlantic slave trade was one of the darkest chapters in human history, lasting from the 16th to the 19th century. Over 12 million Africans were forcibly taken from their homeland, bound for the Americas. But the ripple effects of this trade didn't just devastate individual lives. It tore apart entire communities and reshaped Africa in ways still felt today. In the late 1400s, European powers began exploring Africa's coast, and by the early 1500s, they established trade routes. At first, Europeans traded goods like textiles and firearms with African kingdoms, but soon, the demand for labor in the colonies of the Americas led to the tragic shift. Europeans began capturing and forcibly transporting Africans to work on sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations. By the 1600s, the transatlantic slave trade was in full force. European traders exchanged slaves for goods such as rum, guns, and other resources, creating a brutal system of exploitation. The people of Africa were not just victims, they were commodities in an international market. The effects of the slave trade were catastrophic for African societies. Entire generations were lost. Families were torn apart as millions of men, women, and children were abducted, often violently, from their homes. Some were captured in raids by rival tribes, encouraged by the promise of European trade goods. Others were sold by their own leaders, lured by the wealth that the slave trade brought. One of the greatest tragedies was the impact on the social fabric. Communities were destabilized, with many African societies left weakened by the loss of their strongest and most productive members, farmers, warriors, and artisans. In many regions, warfare escalated as rival kingdoms and tribes vied for control of the lucrative slave trade routes. Economically, the slave trade drained Africa of its resources. While some African kingdoms initially benefited from trading slaves, the long-term consequences were disastrous. The reliance on slave trading destabilized traditional industries, such as agriculture and local craftsmanship. The constant demand for slaves also discouraged the development of trade in other goods or industries. This left many African nations in a state of economic decline and dependency on European powers. The impact was particularly severe in regions like West Africa, where the Kingdom of Dahomey and the Ashanti Empire actively participated in the slave trade, trading captured people for guns and other European goods. However, as European demand for slaves grew, African societies found themselves increasingly drawn into cycles of violence, corruption, and exploitation. The psychological toll on African communities was also profound. The forced removal of so many people contributed to the loss of culture and traditions, as entire generations were torn from their ancestral lands. Families were forever broken, and many African cultures experienced a deep sense of loss and dislocation. The legacy of the slave trade still echoes today. Many African diaspora communities, particularly in the Americas, still face the scars of their ancestors' forced migration, while many African countries continue to struggle with the aftermath of centuries of exploitation. The slave trade did not end without resistance. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, abolition movements emerged in Europe and the Americas, spearheaded by individuals like Olaudah Equiano, a former slave who became an outspoken abolitionist. Meanwhile, African leaders and communities also fought back, although their efforts were often crushed by overwhelming European military might. In 1807, the British Parliament passed the Abolition Act, ending the slave trade in the British Empire, followed by similar laws in other nations. But by then, the damage had already been done. Africa had been altered forever, with its population, economy, and societies irreparably harmed by centuries of exploitation. The transatlantic slave trade was more than a mere historical event. It was a profound disruption to Africa's people, cultures, and civilizations. Its legacy is still evident in the struggles of African nations today, and in the African diaspora's ongoing fight for recognition, justice, and reparations. Understanding this history is crucial to healing the wounds of the past and ensuring a more equitable future. References: The Transatlantic Slave Trade by James A. Raleigh. The African Slave Trade. A History by Basil Davidson. BBC History. The Transatlantic Slave Trade. End screen. If you found this video informative, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more insights into history's untold stories.